The first time I realized my family could erase me without raising their voices was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that looks harmless in hindsight. It was early December, cold but not dramatic. The sky outside my apartment window was the dull gray that makes everything feel paused. I was 31, then old enough to trust my instincts, young enough to still believe loyalty would eventually be returned. My phone rang while I was making soup. I remember because I let it ring twice, not out of avoidance, but because I had flour on my hands and didn't want to smear it on the screen. When I picked up, my mother's voice came through calm and controlled, the way it always did when she had already decided how a conversation would end. "We're finalizing some paperwork," she said. "Nothing urgent, just wanted to keep you in the loop." That phrase should have warned me. Keep you in the loop. In my family, it usually meant decisions were already made. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause, brief but deliberate. "The house, the trust, just housekeeping," she said. "Your brother and I went over it with your father." My chest tightened slightly, not from shock, but from recognition. This was familiar. Conversations where my role was to listen, not participate. And I said, "Well," she continued, "since Daniel is taking over the family business, it made sense to simplify things." Simplify, another word that often meant remove. I turned off the stove and leaned against the counter. The soup could wait. This couldn't. "What does that mean for me?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "You're independent," she said finally. "You've always been strong. We assumed you'd understand." That was the moment. Not the betrayal, not yet. The moment was realizing that love in my family had always been measured by usefulness. And usefulness, once assumed, could be quietly reallocated. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for reassurance. I said, "Send me the documents." She hesitated. "There's no need to get worked up." "I'm not," I said. "I just want to see them." The documents arrived 3 days later. A thick envelope with my name typed neatly on the front. Inside were pages of legal language that stripped me of any illusion I'd still been holding on to. The trust had been amended, the house reassigned. The language was clean, professional, and devastating in its politeness. I wasn't disinherited in the dramatic sense. I was minimized, reduced to a clause that framed me as optional. There was no mention of discussion, no acknowledgement of contribution, no space for consent, just a signature line that wasn't mine. I sat on my couch and read it twice, then a third time. What surprised me wasn't the sadness, it was the clarity. This hadn't happened suddenly. It had been building for years. I was the daughter who handled things quietly, the one who paid her own way early, the one who didn't need help, which in my family translated to didn't need consideration. Daniel was different. He was louder, more visible, more comfortable taking up space. When he struggled, it became a family issue. When I adapted, it became my personality. At Thanksgiving, he spoke and everyone leaned in. When I spoke, conversations continued over me, not intentionally, not maliciously, just naturally. I had told myself that being low maintenance was a virtue. It wasn't. It was a convenience. I didn't call my parents after reading the documents. I didn't text my brother. I didn't seek validation from anyone who had already decided my silence meant agreement. Instead, I did something small and uncharacteristic. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Allison Price. She was older than me by at least 2 decades and had the kind of presence that made you feel seen without being handled. She didn't interrupt when I explained the situation. She didn't rush to outrage. She read the documents carefully, page by page. Then she looked up at me and said, "They didn't do anything illegal." I nodded, I assumed as much. But she continued, "They made a structural decision without you. That tells me something." What I asked, that they believe you won't challenge it, that landed harder than anything else. I drove home afterward in silence, hands steady on the wheel, mind racing in slow, deliberate loops. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires surprise. What I felt was something colder. Displacement. I had been moved out of my own life without being consulted. That night, my brother texted me. "Mom said you got the paperwork, hope you're okay." No apology, no explanation, just a check-in that assumed compliance. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I put my phone down. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. This wasn't the moment for emotion. This was the moment for observation. I began paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The way my parents spoke about legacy as if it belonged to one child. The way Daniel referred to the business as his responsibility long before it legally was. the way my role had quietly shifted from daughter to backup. I had been written into the family as support, not stake. And now that support was no longer required. The irony was almost elegant. The first chapter of this story didn't end with a fight or a tearful phone call. It ended with a decision. I would not ask to be included. I would not plead for recognition. I would not perform hurt for people who preferred me quiet. If they wanted to restructure power without me, I would respond in the only language that mattered: structure. I opened my laptop and started a new folder. I named it simply Records. That was the beginning. Once you notice the pattern, it's impossible to stop seeing it. After the documents arrived, nothing in my family changed on the surface. That was the unsettling part. No awkward apologies, no tense phone calls, no sudden coldness. Life continued as if nothing significant had happened, which told me exactly how insignificant my exclusion was meant to be. My mother still sent photos of her garden. My father still forwarded articles about the economy. Daniel still texted the occasional update about the business written in the tone of someone reporting progress to a subordinate, not a sibling. They had already moved on. I hadn't even officially reacted. That silence created space. And in that space, I started replaying memories I had filed away as normal. The time I took a lower-paying job out of college so Daniel could move back home and find himself without pressure. The year I covered my own health insurance because my parents said it was simpler than adjusting the family plan. The countless holidays where my travel schedule flexed around everyone else's needs. None of these moments felt abusive on their own. That's why they worked. Control rarely arrives as cruelty, it arrives as expectation. I remembered a conversation from years earlier, one I hadn't thought about until now. We were sitting around my parents' kitchen table, papers spread everywhere. Daniel had just announced he wanted to take a bigger role in the business. My father was energized, already talking strategy. "You're good at logistics," my mother had said to me almost as an afterthought. "If we ever need help organizing things, you'd be perfect." I had smiled, said of course, that's what I always did. What I didn't hear then was what she didn't say. She didn't say ownership, she didn't say partnership, she didn't say future. She said help. I realized then that the trust amendment wasn't a betrayal out of nowhere. It was the natural conclusion of a story that had been quietly written for years. The following week, Daniel called me. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was casual to the point of arrogance. "Hey, just wanted to make sure there's no weirdness. This stuff can get complicated, but you know Mom and Dad are just trying to do what makes sense." Makes sense for whom? I didn't call back. Instead, I met Allison again. This time I brought questions instead of documents. "What options do I actually have?" I asked. She didn't sugarcoat it. "You can contest, but it would be expensive emotionally and financially. And based on what you've shown me, that's not what this is about." She was right. I wasn't trying to reverse their decision. I was trying to understand what it revealed. "They assumed you wouldn't push back," she said again. "That assumption is leverage. The moment you stop confirming it, the dynamic changes." How? I asked. She leaned back in her chair. "By removing yourself from the structure that benefits from your compliance." That sentence followed me home. Remove yourself. Not explode, not confront, not expose. Remove. I started small. I stopped responding immediately to family messages, not ignoring them, just delaying. Hours instead of minutes, a day instead of hours. Nothing dramatic happened. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed. That hurt more than anger would have, but it also clarified something crucial. My availability had been doing more work than my presence. At work, I noticed a parallel pattern. I was the one people went to when things broke down. The one who filled gaps. The one who smoothed tensions. I was valued, but not protected. I requested a meeting with my manager. Not to complain, to recalibrate. "I need clearer boundaries around my role," I said. "I've been absorbing responsibilities that don't belong to my position." She looked surprised, not offended. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" she asked. I almost laughed, because I thought being needed was the same as being secure. She adjusted my workload that week, just like that. No punishment, no resentment. The contrast was stark. At home, silence meant consent. At work, clarity meant respect. I began to understand that my family dynamic wasn't universal truth. It was a system I had learned to survive in, not one I was required to remain loyal to. The real turning point came at a family dinner. Nothing formal, just pizza and wine. The kind of gathering meant to signal normalcy. I almost didn't go, but I wanted to see something. I wanted to see how they spoke about the future now that the paperwork was done. Daniel dominated the conversation, talking about expansion, staffing, legacy. My father nodded along. My mother smiled the way she does when things feel settled. And once everything's finalized, Daniel said, glancing at me briefly, we'll finally have clarity. I took a sip of water. Clarity for whom, I asked calmly. The table went quiet. Not hostile, unprepared. Well, my father said slowly, for the family. I looked at him. Then why wasn't I included? No accusation, no edge. Just a question. My mother jumped in immediately. We didn't think you'd want the stress, she said. You have your own life. There it was again. Choice made on my behalf. Daniel shifted in his seat. It's not personal, he said. You're just different. Different meant non-threatening. Different meant manageable. Different meant removable. I nodded. Okay. That was all I said. I didn't push. I didn't argue. I didn't explain the cost of what they'd done. I simply observed how quickly they filled the silence with relief. They thought the conversation was over. They were wrong. That night back in my apartment, I opened the records folder again. This time I added a new document. I titled it Timeline. I began writing down dates, conversations, decisions made without me, moments where my role shifted without discussion. Not for court, for memory, because I was starting to understand something dangerous about systems built on quiet people. They rely on forgetting. And I was done forgetting. Chapter 2 ended not with confrontation but with confirmation. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. I was finally seeing the structure clearly. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The next step wouldn't be emotional. It would be strategic. The first thing I lost was my place in the story. Not my home, not my job, not my relationships on paper, just the narrative. Once the paperwork was signed, the way my family talked about the past subtly changed. I noticed it in small corrections, casual rewrites that slipped into conversation like they had always been true. Daniel's always been the business-minded one, my father said one afternoon on the phone, as if that hadn't been something he encouraged, not discovered. You never really liked responsibility, my mother said another time gently, like she was comforting me about a limitation I didn't remember having. I didn't interrupt. I was learning how stories get rewritten without consent. What unsettled me wasn't that they were wrong. It was that they were comfortable being wrong out loud while I was still expected to stay quiet. The shift accelerated after that dinner. Daniel stopped asking for my input entirely. Not that he had asked much before, but now the absence was official. He spoke about the business as if it were already inherited, already consolidated, already his. When I visited my parents' house, files that used to sit openly on the desk were gone. Conversations lowered when I entered the room. Nothing obvious, just enough. I had become peripheral. And with that came something worse. Assumption. They assumed I would adjust. They assumed I would be fine. They assumed that because I hadn't objected loudly, I agreed. That assumption followed me everywhere. When my mother asked if I could help organize old records, since you're good at that sort of thing, she didn't ask if I wanted to, she asked when I could. When Daniel forwarded me an email chain with the subject line, FYI, he wasn't sharing information. He was asserting hierarchy. I started seeing how control doesn't need force when habit does the work. The second thing I lost was my footing. It happened quietly one weekday morning when I realized my parents had listed Daniel as their sole emergency contact. I found out accidentally through a medical portal login my mother had once shared with me for convenience. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't malicious, it was consistent. In their minds, Daniel was the center, I was adjacent. That night, I slept poorly. Not because I was anxious, but because something inside me was recalibrating. I wasn't grieving what I lost. I was mourning what I never actually had. The illusion of equal standing. I went back to Allison a third time. I don't want to contest anything I said, but I want to protect myself. She nodded. From what? Being quietly erased. She didn't ask me to explain further. She already understood. We talked about practicalities. Financial independence I already had. That wasn't the issue. The issue was access. Expectations. Informal obligations that had no legal name but carried real cost. Do you have power of attorney anywhere? She asked. I shook my head. Do they have it over you? She asked next. That question stopped me. Not legally, but functionally, yes. Years of being the reliable one meant they assumed availability, emotional, logistical, and eventually financial if needed. They didn't need documents for that. They had precedent. Allison's advice was simple and unsettling. You need to remove implied authority, she said. Not argue against it. Remove it. How? By formalizing your absence. That phrase stayed with me. Formalizing absence. It sounded cold, it felt necessary. I didn't do anything immediately. Instead, I watched. I paid attention to who reached out and why. My mother called when she needed reassurance. My father called when he needed help with systems. Daniel called only when something required smoothing. No one called to ask how I was doing. That observation hurt, but it also freed me. I wasn't failing to show up. I was fulfilling a role no one had named. Once named, it could be declined. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. Daniel called and left a voicemail. "Hey, we're updating some vendor contracts," he said. "Mom thought you might want to review the language since you're detail-oriented. Let me know." No request, no acknowledgement of the larger context. Just assumption. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't respond. Not to punish him. To test the system. Nothing happened. No follow-up, no concern, no confrontation. The machine adjusted instantly. Someone else filled the gap. That's when it hit me. I wasn't indispensable. I was convenient. And convenience disappears the moment it becomes unavailable. That night, I opened my laptop and drafted a short email. Not to my family. To myself. I wrote down every responsibility I had absorbed over the years without being asked. Every emotional role I had played by default. Every situation where my silence had been interpreted as agreement. Then I wrote one sentence at the bottom. I do not consent to unspoken roles. The third thing I lost was my fear. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to stop worrying about being misunderstood. Enough to stop explaining my intentions. Enough to stop managing other people's comfort at the expense of my clarity. The escalation wasn't explosive. It was procedural. Over the next few weeks, I made quiet adjustments. I updated my own legal documents. I removed my parents from accounts they didn't need access to. I changed beneficiaries. I clarified medical preferences. Not because I expected retaliation, because power flows toward structure. And for the first time, I was building my own. My family didn't notice at first. And that was the point. Control only panics when it senses loss. I wasn't ready for that part yet. But it was coming. Chapter 3 didn't end with confrontation. It ended with a shift. I stopped waiting to be chosen. And once that happened, everything else began to loosen. The moment control senses distance, it doesn't scream. It probes. The first probe came disguised as concern. My mother called on a Tuesday morning earlier than usual. Her voice was softer than it had been in weeks, almost tentative. "You've seemed a little quiet lately," she said. "I just wanted to check in." I held the phone away from my ear for a second and looked at it as if distance might help me hear what wasn't being said. Quiet meant unavailable. Unavailable meant unpredictable. "I'm fine," I said, "just busy." She exhaled, relieved, too quickly. "That's good. We worry when we don't hear from you." That wasn't true. They worried when systems changed without notice. My silence wasn't absence, it was disruption. After we hung up, I wrote the call down in my timeline document. Not the content, the timing. 2 weeks after I stopped responding immediately. 3 days after I ignored Daniel's voicemail. The system had noticed. The next probe came from my father. He asked if I could come by the house that weekend to help him digitize some old records. His tone was practical, almost nostalgic. "You're so good at that stuff," he said. "Daniel's swamped." I almost agreed, reflexively, automatically. Then I felt the pause inside myself, the one I had learned to recognize. "Can you send me a list of what you need?" I asked. There was a brief silence. "Well," he said slowly, "it's easier if you're here." "I understand," I replied. "But I won't be able to come this weekend." He didn't argue, he didn't press. He sounded disappointed. That used to break me. This time it didn't. What followed was something I hadn't anticipated. They escalated sideways. Instead of confronting me directly, my parents began talking around me. Family updates were shared through Daniel. Decisions were mentioned after the fact. I learned about things secondhand like a distant relative. It was a subtle punishment, social demotion, and it worked at least for a moment. I caught myself wondering if I should reinsert myself, show goodwill, prove I wasn't pulling away entirely. That urge scared me more than their behavior, because it meant the conditioning was still there. The next family gathering confirmed it. It was my aunt's birthday. Casual, nothing loaded on the surface. I arrived on time, brought a gift, smiled when appropriate. The room felt different, not hostile, adjusted. People spoke to me politely, carefully, like I was fragile or unpredictable. Daniel dominated the center as usual. He talked about renovations, about the business, about long-term plans. No one looked at me when he spoke. No one checked my reaction. I watched from the outside of my own family. At one point, my aunt leaned over and said quietly, "You must be so relieved to not have all that responsibility." I met her eyes. "What responsibility?" She blinked, confused. Well, the business, the future. I smiled calm. I was never responsible for that. She nodded slowly, absorbing something new. The truth does that. It rearranges assumptions without force. Later that night, Daniel cornered me near the kitchen. You okay? He asked, casual but alert. Yes, I said. He studied me. You've been distant. I've been busy. With what? My life. That landed. He laughed once sharp. You don't have to be dramatic. I'm not, I replied. I'm just not available. His jaw tightened. You don't have to make everything about control. I didn't answer that, because the irony was too precise. That night, I went home and sat in my car for a long time before going inside. I realized something then. They weren't angry because I had been excluded. They were uneasy because I had stopped orbiting. That was the loss of footing. Not mine, theirs. The real betrayal revealed itself the following week. My mother called again. This time she didn't preamble. We're updating our wills, she said, and we think it would help if you came to the meeting. I said nothing. She continued, just to be present, to show unity. There it was. Not inclusion, optics. Why now, I asked. Another pause. Daniel thinks it would look better, she admitted. Given everything. I closed my eyes. So this was the pivot. They didn't want my input. They wanted my presence as proof of harmony, a visual reassurance that nothing was wrong. I won't be attending, I said calmly. Her breath caught. Why? Because I wasn't consulted when decisions were made, I replied. I won't be used to legitimize them after. Silence. Then softly, you're being unfair. That word used to terrify me. Unfair meant selfish, ungrateful, disloyal. This time it felt hollow. I'm being consistent, I said. That's different. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice had hardened. If you keep pulling away, you'll create distance you can't undo. I considered that. I'm not creating distance, I said. I'm acknowledging it. After the call ended, my hands were steady. That surprised me. The escalation had reached the point where they wanted to pull me back in, not because they valued me, but because my absence disrupted their narrative. That was the betrayal, not the paperwork, not the exclusion, the expectation that I would participate in my own erasure to keep them comfortable. That night I emailed Allison. I told her everything. She replied the next morning with 2 sentences. You're approaching the point where observation turns into action. Decide what outcome you want before they force one on you. That clarity was a gift. I didn't want revenge in the theatrical sense. I didn't want apology performances or emotional admissions. I wanted autonomy, and autonomy requires something uncomfortable. Finality. I opened my legal folder and added a new document. Title: Boundaries of Involvement. I wrote slowly, deliberately. What I would no longer do, what I would no longer mediate, what I would no longer absorb. Not as a threat, as a fact. Chapter 4 ended with the realization that the system was tightening because it felt me slipping. And that meant one thing. The next move would decide who held the pen. I was done letting them write for me. When people realize they're losing influence, they don't always fight. Sometimes they rush to redefine the loss. That was what my family tried next. Not confrontation, not apology. Reframing. My mother called again, this time with a tone that sounded almost collaborative, warm, reasonable. The voice she used when she wanted me to feel included without actually being included. We've been thinking, she said. Maybe we didn't explain things well before. I leaned back in my chair and let her continue. We never meant for you to feel pushed out, she said. You know how much we trust you. Trust. Another word that used to feel like belonging. What does trust look like here, I asked. She hesitated. Knowing you'll be there if something goes wrong. There it was. Not authority, not agency. Insurance. I'm not a contingency plan, I said calmly. She sighed, a long practiced sound. Why are you making this so rigid? Because flexibility had always bent in one direction. I'm not making it rigid, I replied. I'm making it defined. That call ended politely, cordially, nothing resolved. But the shift was undeniable. They stopped asking, and instead they started assuming. Daniel emailed me later that week copying my parents. Just looping you in so you're aware, he wrote, outlining a business decision that had already been executed. I didn't respond. Not immediately, not at all. 2 days later, my father called. Did you see Daniel's email, he asked. Yes, I said. And nothing. He cleared his throat. We were hoping you'd weigh in. That's interesting, I said, because the decision was already made. Silence. You didn't ask for my input, I continued. You asked for my approval after the fact. That's not fair, he said. I stayed quiet. He filled the space just like he always did when things felt uncomfortable. We thought you'd appreciate being kept informed. Informed isn't involved, I said, and I'm not interested in symbolic inclusion. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He sounded tired. That was new. The more I stepped back, the more the system revealed its limits. Without me smoothing transitions, misunderstandings lingered. Without me interpreting emotions, tensions stayed unresolved. Without me filling gaps, people noticed the gaps. And slowly, subtly, the pressure shifted. My mother started asking Daniel questions she used to ask me. Daniel started pushing back. They called me less. But when they did, it was different. Not to include me. To offload discomfort. I recognized the pattern immediately. I didn't take the bait. The real escalation came when they tried to formalize my silence. An email arrived from my parents' attorney. It was framed as administrative, neutral, necessary. They wanted me to sign a waiver, a document stating I acknowledged the revised trust and waived future claims. Not required, but encouraged. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Allison. She called me within the hour. They're trying to close the loop, she said, legally and emotionally. What happens if I don't sign, I asked. Nothing, she replied, except the tension stays unresolved, which is what they want to avoid. So this is about comfort, I said. Control, she corrected. They want certainty. I stared at the document again. Signing it would give them peace. Not signing it would give me leverage. But leverage wasn't my goal. Clarity was. I drafted a response. Not to the attorney. To my parents. I kept it brief. I've reviewed the document. I won't be signing it. I'm comfortable with where things stand. No justification. No accusation. Just a boundary. The response was immediate. My mother called. Her voice was tight now, not warm. This feels unnecessary, she said. Why drag things out? I'm not dragging anything, I replied. I'm choosing not to participate. Participate in what, she asked sharply. In simplifying your discomfort, I said. She went quiet. Then softly, you've changed. Yes, I said, that's the point. That call marked the end of something, not the relationship. The illusion. After that, the tone shifted. Less warmth, more formality. My father stopped calling altogether. Daniel stopped looping me in. They had decided, consciously or not, that I was no longer useful in the way they preferred. And that was the most honest thing they had done yet. The loss of standing came quickly after. At a larger family gathering, someone mentioned a future plan I hadn't heard about. Oh, my cousin said, surprised. I assumed you knew. I smiled. I'm not involved anymore. The room stilled just for a second. Then conversation moved on. I felt something settle in my chest. Not rejection. Release. That night alone in my apartment, I opened the records folder again. I added the waiver. I labeled it declined. And then I added something new. A checklist. Not of what they had taken. Of what I was taking back. Time, energy, decision-making, silence chosen. The loss of standing was complete. And instead of falling, I found solid ground. Because once you're no longer trying to hold a place someone keeps removing you from, you can finally decide where to stand. Chapter 5 ended there, with the understanding that the next phase wouldn't be about reacting. It would be about reclaiming, quietly, legally, irrevocably. The thing about reclaiming space is that it doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the pause between an email and a response, in the quiet confidence of not explaining, in the way your body stops bracing for impact that never comes. After I declined to sign the waiver, my family went silent. Not the dramatic kind, no slammed doors, no final messages. Administrative silence. Weeks passed without contact, then a month. I noticed how quickly my nervous system adjusted. Mornings felt slower. Evenings stretched. I stopped checking my phone, reflexively, stopped anticipating calls that would carry obligation disguised as concern. And then just as I was settling into that quiet, the silence broke. Not from my parents, from Daniel. He showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Thursday evening. I saw him through the peephole, hands in his coat pockets, posture stiff with rehearsed restraint. I didn't open the door immediately, not to punish him, to remind myself I had a choice. When I did open it, I didn't invite him in. Can we talk? He asked. Here is fine, I said. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. He launched into it quickly, like someone afraid they might lose momentum. Mom's upset, he said. Dad's frustrated. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. I waited. You're making it harder than it needs to be, he continued. They're just trying to protect the family. I leaned against the doorframe, arms relaxed. From what I asked. He hesitated. From conflict. I nodded. Then why am I the only one being asked to absorb it? He frowned. That's not fair. Neither was making decisions about my place without me, I replied. His voice sharpened. You didn't want responsibility. That was new. I looked at him carefully. When did I say that? He opened his mouth, then closed it. You always said you wanted your own life, he said finally. Yes, I agreed. That doesn't mean I agreed to being erased from this one. The word landed between us. Erased. He laughed once, uncomfortable. You're being dramatic. I didn't react. That used to be my cue to soften. Now it was information. Why are you here? I asked calmly. He exhaled frustration seeping through the performance. Because if you don't sign the waiver, things stay messy, he said. The attorney keeps flagging it. It makes planning harder. For whom? I asked. For everyone, he snapped. I held his gaze. That's not an answer. Silence stretched. Finally, he said it. For me, there it was. The truth rarely arrives loudly. It slips out when the performance falters. This complicates my role, he continued. It makes it look like there's uncertainty. Is there? I asked. He didn't answer. I nodded. Then that's accurate. His face flushed. You're doing this on purpose. Yes, I said. I'm choosing not to clean up a mess I didn't make. He shook his head. You always have to make a point. No, I replied. I finally stopped making exceptions. That was when his tone shifted. From irritation to threat. You know, he said, voice low, Mom and Dad won't take this well. They might pull back even more. I smiled slightly. From what? He stared at me. You think they'll cut me off? I continued. They already did. You just didn't notice because you were standing in the center. He stepped back, reassessing. You don't need to burn bridges, he said. I'm not, I replied. I'm just not standing on one that keeps collapsing. The conversation ended shortly after that. No resolution. No agreement. He left with the same stiff posture he arrived with, but something had shifted. Not in him, in me. For the first time, I felt no urge to chase the outcome. No need to soften the edges, no anxiety about fallout. Because I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The following week, my parents made their move. They sent a formal letter. Not legal, emotional. 3 pages, carefully worded, polite, heavy. They expressed disappointment, confusion, hurt. They spoke about family unity, shared history, sacrifices. They framed my boundaries as distance, my silence as withdrawal, my refusal as punishment. They never mentioned the trust. They never acknowledged exclusion. They never asked what I needed. I read it once. Then I put it down. I didn't respond. That was the turning point, because for the first time the guilt didn't work. I could see the mechanism clearly now. When compliance failed, they tried shame. When shame failed, they tried fear. When fear failed, they would try something else. That's how systems persist. They adapt. I met with Allison again that Friday. I brought the letter. She read it slowly, then looked up. They're escalating emotionally because they can't do it structurally, she said. What should I do? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Nothing, she said, unless you want to shift the power completely. I sat forward. How? She folded her hands. By formalizing your exit. That phrase again. Exit. You mean no contact? I asked. Not necessarily, she said, but legal clarity changes everything. She explained my options. A formal letter outlining boundaries of involvement. A cease of informal consultation. A declaration of non-participation in family business matters. Not hostile. Definitive. Once issued, it would change expectations permanently. They'll be angry, I said. Yes, she agreed, but anger fades faster than ambiguity. I went home and thought about it all night. About the dinners where I'd sat quietly while plans formed around me. About the way my usefulness had been mistaken for consent. About how often I had swallowed discomfort to keep things smooth. And I realized something that felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I had been afraid of losing them, but what I had actually been losing was myself. The next morning I drafted the letter. It was short, clear, unemotional. I stated that I would no longer be involved in family business decisions, reviews, or logistics. That I would not serve as intermediary or support role. That I wished to maintain personal relationships based on mutual respect, not obligation. No accusations, no demands, just reality. I sent it. Then I turned my phone off. When I turned it back on hours later, there were missed calls, messages, voicemails. I didn't listen to them, not yet, because Chapter 6 wasn't about reaction. It was about crossing a threshold. Once you formalize your exit from a system that feeds on your compliance, there is no undoing it. And I didn't want to undo it. I wanted to see what happened next, without me holding it together. That was the real test. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in. I woke the morning after sending the letter expecting to feel panic, a spike of regret, the instinctive urge to check messages and manage the damage. Instead, there was a strange stillness. Not peace, not yet. Space. I made coffee and drank it slowly. I let the phone sit untouched on the counter. I went to work and focused without effort, as if some background noise I hadn't realized was there had finally shut off. By midday, curiosity crept in. I checked my voicemail. My mother had left 3 messages, each one slightly different in tone. The first confused, the second wounded, the third firm. My father left one, short, controlled. Daniel left none. That silence told me more than any argument could have. He understood exactly what the letter meant. It removed his access. The next escalation came through someone else. My aunt called that evening. She rarely called me directly. She preferred group settings, shared spaces where nothing felt too exposed. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said gently. "But is everything okay between you and your parents?" I recognized the move immediately. Third-party pressure, concern framed as care. "I'm okay," I said. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "Your mother is very upset. She says you've shut her out." I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't rush to defend myself. "I set boundaries," I said. "They're not used to that." Another pause. "Well, my aunt said carefully, family is family." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yes. And boundaries are part of family too." She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She ended the call politely, but the message had been delivered. They were mobilizing, not to reconcile, to contain. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. A cousin texted asking if I was doing okay. An uncle mentioned casually that my parents were confused by my behavior. No one asked what had happened, only why I was reacting. That was the tell. In systems like this, the problem is never the action that caused harm. The problem is the person who stops absorbing it quietly. The breaking point arrived a week later. My parents requested a meeting. Not a call, not dinner. A meeting. At their house, on a weekday afternoon. The structure alone was a message. Formal, controlled on their terms. I considered declining. Instead, I countered, "I'm available for a call," I wrote back, "not an in-person meeting." The reply came from my father. "That's disappointing." I stared at the word longer than necessary. Disappointing had always been his way of expressing disapproval without engaging. A verdict, not a conversation. "I understand," I replied. "Let me know if you'd like to talk by phone." They didn't respond. 2 days later, something shifted. I received an email from the attorney again. This time, it wasn't about waivers. It was about assets, specifically a small investment account my parents had opened years ago in my name. One I had forgotten about because it had never felt significant. They wanted to transfer management to Daniel. The justification was efficiency. I forwarded the email to Allison immediately. She called me within minutes. "This is important," she said. "How?" I asked. "It's a test," she replied. "They're seeing if your boundaries are real." I thought about that. "If I say no," I asked. "They'll escalate," she said calmly. "But they'll also learn." "Learn what?" "That you're not bluffing." I took a breath. "I say no," I said. We drafted the response together. Polite, direct, unambiguous. I declined the transfer. I stated that any assets in my name would remain under my control. I requested that future communication regarding my finances be directed to me alone. No emotion, just fact. The response was immediate. "My father called." I answered. "This isn't necessary," he said without greeting. "You're complicating things." "I'm clarifying," I replied. "You're acting like we're trying to take something from you," he said. "You are," I said evenly. Silence. Then his voice dropped. "You're creating division in this family." I let that sit. "Division existed before I named it," I said. "I'm just not covering it anymore." He exhaled sharply. "So this is how it's going to be?" "Yes," I said, "this is how it is." The call ended without goodbye. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, and felt something finally break loose. Not sadness. Illusion. I had spent years believing that if I explained myself clearly enough, patiently enough, they would understand. They didn't misunderstand. They disagreed. And that changed everything. The twist didn't come from them. It came from me. Because for the first time, I stopped framing my actions as responses. I started seeing them as choices. I didn't need to justify them. I didn't need witnesses. I didn't need agreement. The family system began to reorganize without me. Decisions were made faster. Mistakes went unbuffered. Tensions surfaced that I had quietly managed for years. I heard about it through fragments. Arguments Daniel wasn't prepared to navigate. My mother overwhelmed by details she had once handed to me. My father frustrated by delays. They had assumed removing me would simplify things. Instead, it exposed how much invisible labor I had been providing. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought resolve. Because now the revenge wasn't hypothetical. It was structural. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't threatened. I had simply stopped performing the role that kept their system stable. And the system was faltering. That's when I understood the true leverage. Not exposure. Absence. Chapter 7 ended with a quiet certainty settling in my chest. They were beginning to feel the cost of my compliance. And I hadn't lifted a finger. The next step wouldn't be louder. It would be final. The collapse didn't happen where I expected. It didn't happen at a family dinner or in a lawyer's office. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. It happened quietly inside a system that had never been tested, without me holding one end of it together. I heard about it by accident. A colleague of mine, someone who had no connection to my family, mentioned Daniel's company during a casual conversation. The tone was off, curious, careful. "I didn't realize your brother was involved with that firm," she said. "They've been struggling lately." I felt my posture straighten instinctively before I relaxed it again. "Struggling how?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She shrugged. "Delays, conflicting decisions, vendors complaining about communication, nothing catastrophic, just messy." Messy. That word followed me home. For years, mess had been my silent responsibility. I was the one who clarified, smoothed, translated, anticipated. I had absorbed disorder before it reached the surface. Without me, it was visible. The following week confirmed it. My mother called. Not emotional, not angry. Tired. "I don't know how you handled all of this," she said abruptly. "There are so many moving parts." I said nothing. She continued, filling the silence. "Daniel is good at big ideas, but he gets frustrated with details. Your father doesn't have the patience he used to. Everything feels heavier." Heavier. I almost smiled. Not out of cruelty, out of recognition. That weight had lived on my shoulders for years. It just hadn't been acknowledged. "I'm sorry you're overwhelmed," I said calmly. There was a pause. I didn't say that, she replied. No, she hadn't. She was describing a problem, not asking for relief. The old version of me would have stepped in right there. Offered solutions, suggested systems, taken notes. I didn't. After the call ended, I felt something click into place. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because the structure was failing. That distinction mattered. A few days later, Daniel texted. The message was brief. "Can we talk?" No context, no apology. Just assumption. I didn't respond immediately. I waited until the next day. "Yes," I wrote. "What about?" Several minutes passed. "Everything," he replied. I chose my words carefully. "Then be specific." There was no reply. That silence was new. It told me he was realizing something uncomfortable. He didn't know how to ask without conceding ground. The real twist arrived later that week. I received an email notification from a shared cloud service I hadn't used in months. A file had been accessed. My file. The investment account documents. Someone had tried to move money without authorization. Not successfully, but deliberately. I called Allison immediately. She didn't sound surprised. "This is escalation," she said. "Not smart, but predictable." "What do?" I asked. "You document it," she replied. "And then you decide whether to formalize consequences." That phrase again. Formalize. I requested the access logs. I saved everything. Timestamps, IP addresses, correspondence. The attempt hadn't gone through, but the intent was clear. They were testing whether my boundaries were performative. They weren't. Allison drafted a letter that afternoon. It was addressed to the attorney. It stated that unauthorized access to my financial accounts would result in legal action. It clarified that no family member had permission to manage, review, or initiate transactions on my behalf. Professional, firm, unemotional. When it was sent, something shifted. The phone calls stopped. The messages ceased. The system didn't probe anymore. It retreated. That was the moment I understood the real nature of power. It isn't loud. It isn't emotional. It doesn't plead. It creates consequences and lets people adjust. The fallout was swift. Daniel didn't call again. My parents stopped referencing shared assets entirely. The family narrative changed. I was no longer busy or independent. I was difficult. I heard it through others. "She's being very rigid. She's changed. She's made things complicated." I accepted the label. Because complicated people can't be controlled easily. A week later, my father sent a short email. "We need to talk about next steps." I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Allison. Her reply was immediate. "You don't need to meet. You've already taken back control. Anything further only benefits them." I closed my laptop. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting. I was ahead. The revenge wasn't exposure. It wasn't confrontation. It was this. They had tried to move forward without me assuming I would remain accessible when they needed stability. I removed that option. I had taken back ownership, not just of assets, of my position. And without my consent, their system couldn't function the way it used to. Chapter 8 ended there. Not with celebration, with confirmation. They finally understood that silence wasn't weakness. It was withdrawal. And withdrawal had consequences. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It consolidates. After the failed attempt to access my account, the silence wasn't peace. It was recalibration. They weren't regrouping emotionally. They were adjusting strategy. I could feel it, not because of what they said, but because of what they stopped saying. My mother no longer framed things as misunderstandings. My father no longer talked about unity. Daniel stopped pretending this was about family at all. The tone shifted from persuasion to positioning. I learned that through a mutual contact, someone adjacent enough to the family business to hear things, but not invested enough to protect the narrative. Your brother is trying to restructure ownership, she told me quietly over coffee. He's telling people it's cleaner this way. Cleaner. That word again. Clean always meant less resistance. Is that legal, I asked? She shrugged. It depends on who's watching. I thanked her and went home. That night I didn't sleep much, not from anxiety, from clarity. I had reached the point where silence alone was no longer enough. The system wasn't just reacting. It was trying to finalize without me. I called Allison in the morning. I think they're trying to move faster, I said. I agree, she replied, which means it's time to stop being implicit. What do you recommend, I asked. She didn't hesitate. You assert standing. The phrase landed heavily. Standing. Not involvement, not participation. Standing. You mean legally, I asked. Yes, she said, and formally. She explained my options. A recorded objection, a notice of interest, a documented statement clarifying my position regarding shared history, prior contributions, and future exclusion. Not a lawsuit, a line in the sand. If you don't do this, she said, they'll keep acting as if you don't exist. I thought about that. How often my existence had been acknowledged only when it was useful. I want to do it, I said. The document took 2 days to prepare. It was precise, fact-based, unemotional. It outlined my history with the family business, my prior involvement, my exclusion from recent decisions, my refusal to waive rights, my expectation that no further actions be taken that implied my consent or absence. It didn't accuse. It asserted. When it was filed, the response was immediate. Daniel called. I didn't answer. He texted. We need to talk now. I waited. Then I replied. No, you can communicate through counsel. There was a long pause. Then one more message. You're blowing this up. I didn't respond. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one escalating. I was the one ending ambiguity. The next move came from my parents. They requested mediation, neutral ground, professional setting, third party. It sounded reasonable. It was also late. I considered it carefully. Not whether it would help them, whether it would cost me. Mediation requires compromise. Compromise assumes shared power. That assumption no longer existed. I declined. I stated that my position had been formally communicated and did not require further discussion. That refusal did something unexpected. It shifted the narrative externally. Word spread quietly, not as scandal, as fact. She's not participating. She's legally protected herself. She's stepped away. Those statements traveled faster than explanations ever could. People adjusted. Vendors stopped looping me in. Associates stopped assuming. The story simplified. The family tried one last maneuver. My mother wrote me a letter. Handwritten. Not emotional, not accusatory. Just tired. She said she didn't understand how things had gone so far. She said she missed me. She said she hoped we could find a way forward. I read it slowly. Then I placed it in my records folder. Not as evidence, as closure. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood something essential. Understanding wasn't the missing piece. Consent was. And I had withdrawn it. The revenge didn't look like destruction. It looked like documentation. It looked like boundaries that held under pressure. It looked like a system forced to acknowledge someone it had tried to erase. The most unexpected consequence came a few weeks later. The business deal Daniel had been pushing quietly stalled. Not publicly. Internally, uncertainty had crept in. Questions were asked. Delays followed. Nothing dramatic, but enough. I heard about it through channels that had never reached me before. People are being careful, someone said. There's more scrutiny now. I didn't celebrate. I observed. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about preventing further harm. To myself, the power had shifted. Not because I demanded it. Because I made my position unavoidable. Chapter 9 ended with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief. Resolution. The next chapter wouldn't be about them at all. It would be about what happens when you finally stop orienting your life around a system that never intended to include you, and what it takes to rebuild yourself outside of it. When the noise finally faded, what remained was unfamiliar. Quiet, yes, but not the fragile quiet that follows conflict. This was steadier, earned. For the first time in months, no one was asking me to react. No one was testing my availability. No one was trying to pull me back into a role I had already stepped out of. The system had adjusted, not gracefully, not willingly, but it had adjusted. I noticed the change in my body before my mind caught up. I slept through the night. I stopped replaying conversations in the shower. I could sit still without anticipating interruption. That was when I realized how deeply conditioned I had been to remain alert. Alert to tone, alert to timing, alert to the unspoken expectation that I would step in before things broke. Without that constant vigilance, there was space. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I started asking myself questions I had never had room for before. What do I want next? Not what should I do? Not what will keep things calm. Not what will make this easier for everyone else. What do I want? The question felt almost indulgent at first, then uncomfortable, then grounding. I met with Allison again not to discuss my family, but to discuss me. I want to cleanly separate, I told her. Not just legally, structurally. She nodded. That usually comes next. We talked through practical steps. Updating documents, clarifying beneficiaries, establishing clear lines so that no future confusion could pull me back into something I had already left. None of it was dramatic. It was methodical. Each signature felt like reclaiming a square inch of ground that had been quietly occupied for years. During that time, something else shifted. People at work started responding to me differently. Not because I had changed my tone, but because I had changed my posture. I no longer volunteered for things I didn't want. I didn't over-explain. I didn't apologize for needing time. And nothing collapsed. In fact, things improved. I was promoted again. This time not because I was reliable, but because I was decisive. Leadership noticed the difference. I noticed it too. Reliability keeps systems running. Decisiveness reshapes them. One evening, weeks after the last legal filing, my father called. I didn't expect it. His voice sounded older, less controlled. I just wanted you to know, he said slowly, that things are different now. I know, I replied. There was no accusation in his tone, no defensiveness, just fact. We didn't realize how much you were holding together, he admitted. I let that sit. I didn't either, I said. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't suggest reconciliation. He didn't frame it as regret. He said, I hope you're well. I am, I replied. And for the first time, it was completely true. After we hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. The revenge, if anyone wanted to call it that, had already happened. I had removed myself from a system that relied on my silence. I had replaced unspoken obligation with documented autonomy. I had stopped asking for a seat at a table that only valued me as labor. And in doing so, I had forced everyone else to confront the structure they had built without me. Not through confrontation, through absence. That kind of power doesn't shout. It endures. Chapter 10 didn't end with reconciliation or punishment. It ended with ownership. Of my time, of my choices, of my future. The final chapters wouldn't be about undoing the past. They would be about living forward, without permission. I thought the hardest part was over. That was naive. The real test doesn't come when you leave a system. It comes when the system realizes you're not coming back and starts adjusting without you in ways that brush against your life again. The adjustment didn't arrive through my parents. It arrived through paperwork. One morning, I received a notice from a financial institution I hadn't interacted with directly in years. It was addressed to me formally with language that made my stomach tighten before I even opened it. There had been an inquiry. Not an action, not a transfer. An inquiry. Someone had asked questions about historical contributions tied to my name. Old records. Early stage support. Things that predated the trust changes. Things that lived in gray space rather than clean ownership. I recognized the move instantly. They weren't trying to take something. They were trying to redefine what I had already given. That afternoon, I sat across from Allison again. She read the notice carefully, then looked up. They're trying to reframe your role retroactively, she said. To what end, I asked. To minimize standing, she replied. If they can recast your involvement as informal, optional, or non-material, it strengthens their narrative. So they're rewriting history, I said. Yes, she agreed, legally. I felt something rise in my chest, not anger but resolve. No, I said. They don't get to do that. Allison nodded. Then this is where you finish it. She explained the final option I had avoided until now. A formal declaration. Not public, not inflammatory. A document entered into records stating my contributions, my exclusion, and my refusal to accept retroactive minimization of my role. It wouldn't attack them. It would anchor the truth. Once filed, it couldn't be erased or quietly edited later. This isn't revenge, Allison said. This is preservation. I went home and sat with that word. Preservation. I thought about the younger version of myself who had said yes automatically, who believed showing up quietly was the same as belonging, who trusted that consistency would eventually be rewarded. She deserved preservation. Not as a martyr, as a person who had been present useful and then dismissed when that usefulness became inconvenient. I authorized Allison to proceed. The document took longer this time, not because it was complex, but because it required precision. Dates, roles, communications, decisions made without consultation, evidence of exclusion following years of involvement. No emotion, just sequence. When it was filed, the response was immediate. Not outwardly, internally. The inquiries stopped. The tone of communication shifted. The system recognized the boundary not as resistance, but as permanence. Daniel tried one last time. He emailed me directly, bypassing counsel. "I don't understand why you're doing this," he wrote. "This could have been simpler." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied with one sentence. It was simple when I was silent. I didn't hear from him again. My parents didn't reach out either. And for the first time, that didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like alignment. The final confrontation never happened because it didn't need to. The climax wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I had moved the conflict into a space where performance didn't matter. Only records, only facts, only consent. Weeks passed, then months. The story settled. I rebuilt parts of my life that had been quietly neglected. Friendships that didn't require me to mediate. Hobbies that didn't serve anyone else's needs. Even rest felt different when it wasn't borrowed time. One evening, I found myself at dinner with women older than me, colleagues and friends, who had lived long enough to recognize patterns without romanticizing them. One of them asked, "Do you ever wish you'd handled it differently?" I thought carefully. "No," I said. "I wish I'd trusted myself sooner." They nodded, not in agreement, in recognition. That was when I understood the real cost of what I had survived. It wasn't the inheritance. It wasn't the business. It was the years spent believing love meant compliance. That silence was safety. That being easy was the same as being valued. Letting go of that belief was the final act. Not cutting contact, not legal action, but rewriting the internal rulebook that had governed my choices long before any documents existed. Chapter 11 ended without applause, without closure from them, but with something stronger. Integrity, the kind that doesn't need to be defended, because it's already been chosen. The last thing to change was my understanding of peace. For most of my life, peace meant smoothness. No tension in the room, no unanswered messages, no conversations left unfinished. I thought peace was something you maintained by staying alert, flexible, agreeable. I was wrong. Peace is not something you maintain for other people. It's something you stop sacrificing. The months after everything settled were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. Not empty, not lonely, just unoccupied by obligation. My phone no longer felt like a leash. My calendar had white space I didn't rush to fill. Decisions belonged to me alone, and no one waited on the other side of them to be appeased. My parents and I found a new distance that was honest, if not warm. We spoke occasionally, carefully, without expectations hiding behind small talk. When we did talk, there was no rewriting of the past, no attempt to smooth it over. The silence around what had happened was no longer denial. It was acceptance. Daniel disappeared from my life entirely. Not dramatically, not with a final message. He simply stopped trying. And that told me everything I needed to know. Our relationship had never been about closeness. It had been about access. Once access was gone, there was nothing left to negotiate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. At work, something unexpected happened. Younger women began seeking me out, not for gossip, not for sympathy, for clarity. They asked how I learned to say no without apologizing, how I stopped overfunctioning, how I knew when loyalty had crossed into self-erasure. I didn't give speeches. I told them the truth. It wasn't one moment, I said. It was choosing myself in small ways until it stopped feeling radical. That's how change actually works. Not with explosions, with repetition. One evening, close to the anniversary of the day, I first opened that envelope with the revised documents. I took myself out to dinner. No reason, no celebration, just acknowledgement. I sat by the window and watched the city move. People passing with their own invisible histories, their own negotiations with family duty expectation. I wondered how many of them were carrying roles they had never agreed to, mistaking endurance for love. I paid the bill and walked home slowly. That night, I opened the file that had followed me through this entire process. The one that started as records. The one that grew into timelines, letters, boundaries, proof. I added one last entry. I am no longer available for relationships that require me to disappear. I am no longer negotiating my worth through usefulness. I am no longer mistaking silence for harmony. Then I closed the file. I didn't need it anymore. The kind of revenge people expect is loud, public, final in a way that demands witnesses. This wasn't that. This was quieter. I didn't destroy anyone's reputation. I didn't expose secrets for spectacle. I didn't force apologies. I withdrew my labor. I reclaimed my autonomy. I chose clarity over comfort. And the system that relied on my compliance adjusted without me. That's the kind of payback that lasts. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, let me tell you this without drama or softness. You are not difficult for wanting boundaries. You are not disloyal for refusing control disguised as love. You are not selfish for choosing yourself when the cost of belonging is erasure. Family that only functions when you stay silent is not harmony. Love that depends on your compliance is not love. Peace that requires you to disappear is not peace. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what moment in your life forced you to choose yourself. Share it in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, please like and subscribe so more people who need them can find them. Wherever you are tonight, remember this. The moment you stop asking for permission to exist as you are, everything changes, quietly and permanently.